One might be forgiven for thinking, while listening to the more strident voices in the media, that there is some great conflict or crisis occurring in the present time between the drive towards a natural family life and gender equality when it comes to pursuing careers outside the home, especially for women. We often hear about the urgent need for affordable childcare under the banner of progressive childcare initiatives. The Scandinavian model, for example, where the percentages of men and women working outside the home is the most equal, is often lauded. An official policy of the EU is that they want 75% of its people between the ages of 20 and 64 to be in the workforce. So one might imagine that some of the promotion of this agenda comes from this source. However, the reality is somewhat different. At least 50% of women who have children stay at home at the moment, in Ireland and throughout Europe. And furthermore, about 2/3 of women who have children say that they would prefer to stay at home if they had the choice and if they could financially manage it. And yet still, there is this very loud contingent of advocates for keeping women in the workplace as evidence of some sort of gender equality. This idea in practice, however, is never quite as genial as it might appear in policy documents. There is something very poignant, if not disturbing, in the race some make from car to creche to work and back again. The reason this has come to mind is that in the past week here in Ireland, the national TV broadcaster, RTE, ran with a programme by undercover reporters which investigated a chain of creches in Dublin. Viewers were horrified to see crying and mistreated children and infants, children left in unsafe conditions, toddlers flung into cots or beds, and all the children were being fed cheap noodles and watered down milk, among other things. And this all was going on in this creche, despite the fact that TUSLA, which is the government body which has oversight on these matters, had conducted 11 inspections of these creches since 2017. The undercover reporters, for example, were not Garda vetted, police vetted before being employed. One childcare assistant was left to look after 20 children alone. Babies were being held down and pushed on their backs in order to force them into sleep, and one crying child was isolated by himself in a room for misbehaviour. Now, obviously, one has to say that there are many daycare facilities for children which are excellent, and many childcare assistants who work in these places who are very dedicated to their jobs. But there is a bigger issue here, and that is not whether or not individual creches or individual caregivers are kind or not, or suitable or not, and that is whether or not small children should be placed in group settings for daycare. This is not the first time that there's been an exposé on creches in Ireland or daycare. A 2013 investigation showed similar problems, with footage of care workers shouting and swearing at toddlers and children being strapped into chairs for such long periods that they were seen attempting to walk around the room with the chairs still strapped to their backs. The vast majority of childcare facilities in Ireland, creches, are run as private enterprises for profit. Though it must be said that most children who are not minded by parents in the home are generally minded by either a family member or a relative, or sometimes a nanny, and it's about only 15 to 20% of children who go to the group settings of daycare. In any event, as was the reaction to any earlier exposés done on creches, there has been the usual reflexive outcry, people crying crocodile tears at the sight of abused infants and children. What's to be done, people ask. We need more regulation. Men and women both need to work, many are saying, for fulfilment, and because on one wage one does not cover a mortgage these days. We have no choice, it is often claimed, and indeed one must admit that this is the case in many places. Workers do not receive sufficient remuneration in many scenarios these days to enable one spouse to support the purchase or rent of a family home. And this is a fundamental inbuilt problem with the global corporatist system, an issue that has crept in quietly and subversively over the past 2 generations as employment patterns have changed. It was disguised as equal rights for women to access work, but in reality what happened was employers gained the right to exploit both sexes equally. The rising tide did not lift all boats, but instead it swamped most of them. And ordinary people speak quite regularly of being unable to afford to have children at all. There is also, of course, an aspect to be considered whereby people have become quite materialistic and they covet certain aspects of so-called lifestyle. So given these issues, people often cite the Scandinavian models whereby all childcare is state-run and state-funded and very affordable, though it must be remembered that such services are provided because of high levels of taxes. Regardless, for reasons I will cite later, no matter what the source of funding for childcare, nor the regulation or degrees in pedagogy that are mandated for childcare providers in utopian societies, there is something still fundamentally amiss in the very core of a system that shunts children from the bosom of the family into collectivized care facilities. It is my belief that a child, and especially an infant and toddler, needs to be at the centre of some special person's dedicated attention, their mother or father or grandparent or close loved ones. And they need to be regarded as an individual of unique importance and consequence at this foundational stage of their lives. Children are not herd animals. They are not born in swarms or clusters, and they cannot be reared as part of an amorphous herd. Also, it must be said that it is difficult for caregivers outside of the family, no matter what their qualifications are, to feel an instinctive love for each child in their care, and there will always be children with whom they cannot bond. This inability to bond is much rarer in dedicated parents who will tolerate their own children's foibles much better than they would the children of a neighbour or a stranger. Plus, childcare assistants and workers in these creches are very badly paid in Ireland, and one would have to ask why they would put themselves out too much. But aside from all these emotional and subjective responses to childcare, there are good proven reasons to be wary of group settings when it comes to looking after children. While there are often studies which purport to show that children raised in creches do as well, if not better of course, than children reared at home, can these studies be trusted? They are often very generalised and do not factor in the length of time that each child spends in the creche per day, nor the individual child's nature. These studies also usually rate cognitive development and often ignore the emotional development or attachment issues due to multiple caregivers. I remember years ago reading some work by a child psychologist called Oliver James from the UK, who was adamant that childcare is damaging for children under the age of 3. He cited a 2004 study which showed that cortisol levels in 15-month-old children elevate significantly upon going to childcare first, and remain higher in those children than in children reared by carers they know. Cortisol levels even rise in good daycare situations. The studies show that the effect of raised cortisol remains apparent even in the teenage years, with children having higher rates if they attended daycare when young. So while some children from low-income families might benefit academically from the extra stimulation of childcare, in general, he said, most children benefit from close supervision by a responsive individual caregiver. The cortisol study from 2004 caused working parents to react with a mixture of guilt and outrage. Oliver James was projecting, people said. But since then, many studies have borne out these conclusions. A 2017 Norwegian study measured the cortisol levels of 112 toddlers from 85 different childcare centres and found that children spending 8 to 9 hours at the centres had significantly elevated stress markers. the same children had lower levels of cortisol in their blood on the days that they stayed at home. Children who stay for shorter hours in childcare were not as stressed as those left all day. Most children, however, who are left to childcare in these modern societies spend long hours, 40 hours plus, if people will be truthful, in childcare situations with people who are not close to them. Cortisol increases over the day that the child spends in creche, while it decreases over a day spent at home with a primary caregiver. Younger children under 3 show the greatest susceptibility to stress levels rising. These cortisol studies have been replicated many times elsewhere, and it should be noted that this 2017 study from Norway is based in a country where the daycare facilities are regarded as being of excellent standards. It doesn't matter, even in an excellent daycare situation, a child's cortisol levels will rise. It is hard for parents who are struggling financially to hear these facts about children's stress levels, but these facts should not be ignored. Children experience higher levels of stress and aggression if confined to group situations in childcare, especially during the critical period of development in the early years after birth. Any normalization of collectivized childcare in an economic system that enslaves parents seeks to deliberately ignore these measurable effects on vulnerable children. And this is all before one considers any dreadful harm caused by abusive providers, such as was revealed on this recent television program. Long-term studies of decades of research show that children who spend more than 30 hours in childcare every week, which is the average amount of hours spent by children of a working family, are more likely to exhibit aggression, conflict, risk-taking behaviours into adolescence, and that also mothers whose children spend long hours in childcare exhibit less sensitivity in their interactions with their children. Human beings learn from their first and earliest relationships and their secure attachment to their primary caregivers how to love and be loved for the rest of their lives. And yet, instead of a public questioning of a system that is set up to disempower workers and especially to hobble parents financially, we have the usual skirmishes about women and careers and being chained to the sink by people who want to go back to the 1950s, the usual divisive war of the sexes, as if it is not unpleasant for both parents to hand over their child because of their shackles. But perhaps before people have children, they should ask themselves some serious questions about the meaning of life and a career and where to live and so on. Perhaps inputting meaningless figures on a database in some bullshit job is not really a career. Perhaps if people moved away from the cities, perhaps they could afford a home more easily. Could they manage between them then to spend more time with the souls that they have brought into the world?